Great. And so I do largely federal climate policy, and I'll make some attempt to talk about the New York State and city context, but just a little tiny attempt, since it's really not my area, and I'll get in trouble in a hurry if I try to talk about it in much depth. Let me try to give you 5 key messages here in about 15 minutes. The first is that there is a growing consensus that we have to deal with the climate change issue in an aggressive way, and that what that means is limiting emissions such that we reduce by 20% by 2020 and 80% by mid-century. And it bears pausing for a moment to think about what that entails. 80% reduction in warming pollution from current levels entails a complete transformation of the energy economy. Basically, we need to replace everything. We need to do everything differently and better. With that comes a whole range of benefits, of course, in terms of improved national security, reduced dependence on volatile fossil fuel prices, et cetera, but it is a major endeavor. In any event, there is a consensus from the science that we need to move in that direction, and I'm happy to report that the business community is increasingly with us on the need for action and wanting a clear, stable framework in which to begin this transformation of the way we do business across the board. Second point is that if we move forward, as we move forward, I believe, with new leadership from the United States on this issue, it is going to be possible to move faster than people think on the international front as well. I'll make that case in a moment in more depth. Third point is that this is something that we need to get started on in 2009. It's not time for us to wait just because there's a recession underway. And in fact, there's a logic to using climate legislation as a way to help ensure economic recovery. And I'll give you some quick thoughts on that. Fourth point is that the New York community of environmentalists can help in terms of public education, in terms of legislator education. And then, of course, there's all the work that New York State can do in terms of leading on this issue and helping to prepare for impending federal legislation. Lastly, if there's time, there probably isn't, I'll give a quick sense of what NRDC is doing on this issue. So very briefly, and by the way, I invite discussion on the fly, but we'll probably should keep that limited so that we preserve time. This is just a map of all the state and local level initiatives as of April 2008. There's even more that's happened since then. And the key point is that just about 4 or 5 years ago, this map would have been blank. There's been huge leadership at the state and local level on climate in the absence of federal leadership on the issue. And that's been helpful in terms of, among other things, waking up the business community to the fact that they want a federal and ultimately global solution to this problem so they don't have to deal with a patchwork of 50 different regulatory regimes. So there they are, the corporations. U.S. Climate Action Partnership involves NRDC, a number of other groups, and then this range of luminary companies. There is a major announcement coming tomorrow, actually, from this same group. Pleased to say, I can't tell you any of the details, but I'm pleased to say that we are quite excited about what the new announcement will bring. The bottom line, though, is that major Fortune 500 companies are calling for action to reduce emissions. They're calling for a cap that declines over time and gets this process underway with clarity for investors. So what might that look like in the details? Well, the European Union provides at least one model of how we might proceed. And I want to talk about the good and the bad with the experience thus far with the European Union's efforts to control global warming pollution in that context. So as many of you have probably heard, starting in 2005, the European Union launched an emissions trading system, a cap and trade system. And they got 3 things wrong, I would say. And we can learn from all those lessons, and we don't have to repeat any of them, in my view. But as you can see from the yellow line, which looks a little bit like a bad EKG reading or something, the market initially crashed to 0. The reason is that they didn't have their data straight. They, to their credit, launched the cap and trade system in a big hurry in 2005 and learned a lot in the process, and in fact billed the first couple of years of the program as a trial phase. It was a trial in name only, in that there was billions and billions and billions of euros at stake. And in fact, they over-allocated the permits. So they gave too many allowances out relative to the actual emissions levels simply because they didn't know the numbers. And there was gaming on the part of some of the member states that were trying to protect their industry. The good news is that in the US context, we have the data already pretty well straight. We've learned from this experience in the EU context. And I should mention that the whole concept of cap and trade was really developed in the US for acid rain purposes and it has worked brilliantly in terms of cutting sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide pollution in a cost-effective way. So the concept works. You just have to make sure that you do it with some care. Lesson one, make sure that you get the numbers right, and we can do that here. A second issue, which I'll flag in terms of the EU experience, is that in their initial years, and even to some extent still, they gave away a lot of these pollution allowances to emitters based on historic pollution. And that grandfathering, as it's called, of pollution allowances led to windfall profits for the power sector. Again, a lesson that has been learned. President-elect still, Obama, has called for 100% auctioning of pollution allowances. And in any event, we will not see anything like the massive giveaway that occurred in the EU context, given where the debate has trended in the US. There'll be more of a balanced approach here. And the last point is probably too complicated to get into now, but there are questions and challenges around the role of project-based offsets in markets like these. And if there's interest in time, we can talk about that later. Oh, but I also just want to highlight that in the second phase of the market, you've seen a nice stable trading range for CO2 allowances in the European Union context. And this is in some ways one of the most stable of commodity markets right at the moment. Prices have been trending down a bit along with every other financial commodity, but it remains a robust price on emissions. So what about the international context? I would contend that as soon as we show leadership, as soon as we actually move forward in a meaningful way to begin to clean up our own house, it's going to be possible to broker deals with China and other major emitting economies sooner than people think. Up until now, it has been a universal excuse to point to the inaction in the United States and say, why would China ever agree to do anything along these lines of reducing emissions radically, given that the per capita emissions in the US are still 4 or 5 times that in China, even though our overall emissions level is about the same. And let's not even talk about India, where their emissions are 1/20th of ours on a per capita basis. Well, the fact of the matter is that that excuse is about to be blown away, and now we can start to talk about mutually beneficial arrangements in which everyone begins to put a price on carbon, and we begin to march towards something that perhaps even looks like per capita emissions rights equity over a period of decades. Bottom line, though, is that I think that there are deals to be cut, and that major excuse is going to be gone. And thankfully, we'll have, I think, real leadership starting now on this topic. So it's a cause for hope. Just for those who may not be familiar with cap and trade, a brief summary of some of the key elements. The basic way that it works is that you cap emissions, you ratchet down the cap over time, and as you do that, the trading price on this right to pollute, this thing called the CO2 allowance, will tend to go up, because as you mop up the easy emissions reduction opportunities, you're left with more expensive things later in the process. And so as the number of tons in the cap ratchets down to get to that 80% economy-wide reduction by 2050, the price goes up in terms of dollars per ton. The upshot is a relatively stable stream of new revenue, and it's a very large stream of new revenue to the government. If you auction all of the allowances, just illustratively, you're looking at something on the order of $100 to $250 billion a year, depending upon the market price of CO2. So a major new sustained revenue source that can be used for a variety of purposes, as I'll illustrate in a moment.
That's in the United States?
This is just for the U.S. Just for the U.S. And a couple other things to highlight here very briefly. You don't cap everyone. You cap mainly upstream. So huge emitters, industrial sources, power plants, and refineries are the main points of regulation. And they're also the trading entities. And then downstream, everyday consumers and businesses simply see a new landscape of energy prices as the way that they're impacted by this. Let's move on. So here's just an illustration of how you might use, how you might allocate some of that, call it $100 to $250 billion a year in new revenue from the sale of these pollution allowances. Some of it can be dividended back to consumers, and NRDC in general supports making sure that we do at least enough of that to hold low-income consumers whole, to make sure that they're not adversely affected by the legislation. Some of it probably can and should be used for international purposes like adaptation and trying to deal with tropical deforestation, which is, by the way, 1/5 of the global warming problem worldwide. And then this other zone is a complicated terrain, which is basically how do we use some of these funds to achieve public purposes like scaling up energy efficiency and emerging clean technologies. And we won't have time to talk about that in much depth, but let me just attempt to summarize what's on this page. This is inspired by work that I did when I was at McKinsey, which was basically creating a cost curve for greenhouse gas abatement. And the McKinsey version is blindingly complicated, and I throw it up for a laugh sometimes because nobody can read it. But basically, what you have is 8 groups of things that you can do to reduce pollution, global warming pollution. And the cheap stuff is over here, it's energy efficiency, and that's in the savings range. It's actually negative dollars per ton of abatement in order to get this efficiency to happen, right? Because there is a payback from fuel economy in vehicles, there's payback from better light bulbs, and so on and so forth. As you move up here into the positive dollar per ton abatement measures, things become more expensive. And a perfect example of that is carbon capture and storage on power plants. If you want to take the CO2 out of power plants and sequester it in geologic reservoirs, that's inevitably going to be expensive. You've got to put a new gizmo on the power plant, you've got to pipe the CO2, you've got to inject it, and then, by the way, you have to use more coal in the process in order to get the same amount of net power out of it. So whatever you do, that's going to be costly. There are, by the way, some interesting sidebars. Turns out that same CO2 can be used for enhanced oil recovery from existing oil fields. And there's a possible economic benefit that offsets some of those costs. In any event, here you're in sort of a cost zone. Energy efficiency offers this tremendous prospect for a net economic payoff. And the interesting thing is that the McKinsey analysis, and they've now done dozens of these cost curves in the US and in other countries and so on, all of them broadly confirm the result that we had on the first global cost curve, and that is that the benefits from the energy efficiency potential roughly are the same order of magnitude as the costs we need to incur in order to clean up the remaining energy supply that we need. So rough numbers, efficiency can pay for clean supply, and we can get the job done at no net cost. That's just the cost side. On the other hand, the benefits of doing this broadly are, of course, avoiding global warming and all the attendant risks and potentially catastrophic ecological and human impacts. So all in all, a pretty good deal moving forward in a transformation of our energy economy, which basically can pay for itself and save the planet at the same time. Now, what I wanted to say is that there's 3, and I'll probably just close with this, there's 3 things that we think need to happen under effective climate legislation. The first is that you just get the basic architecture right. So don't repeat the mistakes of the European Union, get the numbers right, make sure you don't grandfather too many allowances and so on, and get that price on emissions so that now polluters have to pay across the whole economy for their emissions. But the second thing is to make sure that all this energy efficiency actually happens. You know, in this room, I'll do the question, I guess. How many in this room have retrofitted your entire apartment or home, if you are lucky to have a home, with compact fluorescent lamps? Good, yeah, that's one of the higher quotients I've seen. And of course, so congratulations. But you know, this is a great deal, right? It's $2 for a light bulb now that will save you $40 over the life of the light bulb. And yet, guess what? Less than half of the light bulbs sold today are compact fluorescent lamps. So still plenty of people are foregoing this opportunity. And there are various ways to try to change that picture. One of them is, of course, just performance-based appliance standards. And we support that. In fact, on the light bulbs question, the 2007 Energy Security Act has a performance-based standard for lighting, which will more or less solve that problem over the next 10 years by forcing manufacturers to move towards more and more efficient light bulbs. And then there's smart utility regulation, then there's fuel economy standards in vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. But we need a lot of measures here in order to actually realize this potential, because a price signal alone won't get the job done. And part of that can be using a share of those funds from the sale of pollution allowances to give incentives to various parties to try to encourage people to go above and beyond building standards or appliance standards. The third thing that I would highlight, so it's getting the architecture right, it's trying to make energy efficiency happen despite all kinds of market barriers. And then the last thing is on the innovation front. And there again, a price signal on pollution, just making sure that emitters are paying for their emissions, certainly helps a great deal. but it won't launch a lot of technologies into the market because they're too far out of the money today. So a classic example is solar photovoltaics. Almost certainly will be a very important part of the energy picture over the next 50 years and beyond. The problem is that today, instead of being $40 a ton to use solar photovoltaics instead of conventional electricity, it's probably closer to $200 a ton. It's way out of the money. Nobody's going to do it, and we're not going to tolerate a $200 a ton price on emissions in this country. We don't have to. What we need to do is have near-term, finite, phased-out deployment support for emerging renewables like solar. And then that needs to phase out and sunset completely once you get to a certain level of maturity with that technology or any other emerging clean supply. So 3 things that need to happen. We think we can do all those in the context of legislation that we believe will move very seriously this year and open up lots of opportunities on the international front. And I know I'm probably way over time. I do just want to make a quick statement about the whole question of the current economic context, because there's an important argument here, which is many people now say, well, we're in a recession. We can't possibly put climate legislation into play which would have some impact on energy prices during a recession. It can't be done. You don't talk about anything that looks at all taxy during a recession. Point taken, but it's very important to think about the actual timing of this. If we pass climate legislation, hopefully when we pass climate legislation in 2009, it takes a couple of years at a bare minimum, probably 3 or 4 years, to do the preparatory work to actually launch the full market. You have to get those numbers right. You have to get everybody ready to go and get the whole administrative machinery together. By the way, many of those things are required for a tax as well, but you do need to do some pre-work. And during that time, we can be ramping up incentives for efficiency and emerging clean renewables on a fiscally responsible stimulus basis, right? So it's deficit spending on efficiency and renewables in the next 3 years to ensure economic recovery. Later, there's a way to pay back that deficit, which is not usually the case with fiscal stimulus. The mechanism for paying back those incentives is the sale of these pollution allowances once the market launches. So a period of incentives only on a deficit basis, followed by launching the market and paying back the deficit incurred, all of which helps to guarantee that we get out of this hole that we dug ourselves and we're left with the legacy of a whole new, clean, more secure energy economy. And not exactly a simple set of arguments, but I think a very important frame in which to view this, because there are many who are simply saying, we can't even begin to address this year. I'm not even going to cover the New York stuff because I'm out of my depth here, except to say that very briefly, this is going to be a very heavy political lift to move federal climate legislation. We have much more support now than we did last year on the Hill and certainly in the White House. But this is not something which is in any way guaranteed. So anything that can be done to bolster that support and even make supporters more supportive in Congress is welcome. And then, of course, New York's role as a leader on some of these issues is very important as well. Whatever can be done to support the governor and the mayor in terms of trying to promote new energy, new clean energy is certainly valued as well. And I'll close with that.
Thanks, Bill. And Bill, thank you very much for inviting me, getting this great audience together. And I thought I'd actually start by mentioning this terrific letter that Bill had in yesterday's New York Times, which is very pertinent to what we're talking about today. If you didn't get to see it, why don't you take a look and pass it around. As another prefatory remark, even though I'm new to Nature Network, I'm not necessarily new to some of the institutions that are represented here. There are 3 people here who work for New York City DEP. 2? Okay. I worked there in the early 70s alongside Bernie Tuchman. We did some great work. In fact, some work that first showed me the power of price signals when New York City was able to get through Albany a tax on higher polluting fuel oil, oil with a non-conforming sulfur content. This was at the point where the sulfur content of fuel oil in New York City was being ramped down by a terrific local law in stages. And it's a long story. I can't go into it here, but basically after the oil companies and the utilities came into the city seeking a blanket variance and saying that 25%, they needed to be allowed to have 25% of the oil in the winter of 72, 73 be high sulfur because they couldn't come up with the low sulfur. We at EPA proposed, and the legislature, if you can imagine that, passed a tax that taxed the polluting oil to erase the market differential that the oil companies and utilities would have enjoyed through if they had been allowed to burn the polluting oil. In other words, the tax took away the economic incentive, and at the end of the winter, 2% of all the oil had been non-conforming. I've also I have a little history with the Hudson River Foundation. Anybody know what this is? A core sample from Storm King Mountain. And at, I think it was 1978, at the banquet where Con Ed laid down with the environmentalists and sealed the deal where the Storm King project wouldn't be built in exchange for the environmentalists giving up the cooling towers on the Hudson River. I had a role in doing economic analysis that helped undermine the claims for the Storm King project, and so Con Ed gifted me. I was one of a few dozen people who got these core samples. It was that settlement that provided the endowment that has created the Hudson River Foundation. And last, I have a wonderful history with NRDC. I've been a consultant for NRDC on maybe half a dozen projects over the past 3 decades. NRDC's work on regulatory standards, on appliance efficiency standards, on a whole host of things. I could spend all my time talking about how terrific that work is. But I say that as a preface to my remarks, the burden of which is that NRDC is on the wrong path and is taking the environmental community down the wrong path with a carbon pricing tool. And what I want to convey to you is that the cap and trade, well, thank you, but let me make the case.
She likes your core sample.
Don't tell my wife. If cap and trade could be done, and if it could be done in the way that NRDC wants it done, which is quickly, with 100% auction of permits, with without corruption, without the financial scams that we've seen in our financial sector, that's of course metastasized over the past 6 months. It would not be a bad way to go. The cap and trade system on acid rain, on sulfur dioxide pollution, has been a success in the United States. I will later get into conveying why the sulfur model is not transferable for carbon. But I want to lead with, and this may be all the time I have to do in this first round, with 6 big differences between a carbon tax and cap and trade. And the first involves this issue of price certainty versus quantity certainty. Rick presented the idea that we have to be down in CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050. As if that is a scientific consensus, and more importantly, as if that's a target which, if we meet it, we will be okay, and if we don't meet it, then we're not going to be okay. And it is a fiction that that target or any other target is somehow known or even knowable. The climate system is far too complex. Any climatologist will attest to this. To be able to settle on a number, unlike with acid rain, where they knew if the pH of lakes, fell below a certain level, which fed back to emissions at a certain rate, so they had to get the emissions down by a certain quantity. That was knowable. The world climate system is less straightforward and is under such stress. The only thing that we know is that the reductions that we need reductions greater than any political system that we can conceive of in this country. And this, I'll be candid, applies to either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. But what we need is maximum reductions as fast as possible. There's no particular target. So this quantity certainty that works in some other regulatory spheres is not helpful here. What is needed instead is price certainty. And in a kind of bizarre Heisenberg uncertainty principle where you can have quantity certainty or price certainty, but not both, we need price certainty. Why? Because every day carbon critical decisions are being made, billions in this country, from the mundane of, oh, well, which car am I going to drive today, or how fast am I going to floor the accelerator, which affects carbon emissions, to, more importantly, which car will I buy? Where will I live? Will I live in a place where I don't need a car, or we can have one car instead of two? If I'm an airline, which aircraft will I spec and buy? Or if I'm an aircraft manufacturer, what metals and what design am I going to put into that new plane, which is going to be not even built for 5 years and then will have a life of decades? I need to know now what the carbon price is going to be 5, 10, 20, or 30 years from now. And even though it would be overstating the case to contend that with a carbon tax there will be perfect knowledge, there will be a much clearer sense of that trajectory with a carbon tax than with a cap and trade system. Another aspect of price certainty is volatility. Maybe I'll have a chance to come back to that. The second is this issue of lead time. We are agreed that we've got to get a system in place as soon as possible. And Rick said we need to get started in 2009, and he's absolutely right. A cap and trade system loses on that criterion as well. It is so complex with banking of permits, with monitoring systems, with crafting of offsets, that any cap and trade legislation that would be passed in this Congress, whether in 2009 or in 2010, it's not going to be written to be able to be implemented. The implementation is going to be subcontracted, if you will, to EPA or to some commission that's going to have to write the regs. Consider that the RGGI system, that's the Northeast system for regulating or imposing a cap on CO2, only from power plants, a big sector, but only one of the sectors, took 5 years to put in place, from 2003 to 2008. That's the cap and trade system for 10 states that are kind of a little bit almost homogeneous for one sector. Whereas in contrast, British Columbia took 5 months from conception to implementation to get its carbon tax up and running. The BC provincial government announced it in February 2008, and it went into effect in July 1, 2008. So you're talking about even more than an order of magnitude, a 12-fold difference. And even though things are being learned from the EU or from RGGI, a national system of carbon cap and trade is going to be monstrously complex and is going to take years and years to get started. The issue of international transferability. I have tried to wrap my head around, and I've asked people, and I've never been able to grasp how a U.S. cap and trade system would be transferable anywhere else. Maybe mechanisms, yes, and frameworks, but the amount, the critical issue of how fast that cap is going to come down. Let's say we do a 2% a year so that we go down 80% after 40 years. Why would any other country feel obliged to go down at the same rate? I know if I'm in China or if I'm an Indian, I'm not going to feel obliged because my emissions are 1/5 per capita or 1/20th per capita, and so a 2% rate that might apply or might be appropriate for the U.S. or if Congress passed it, well, in some other less polluting country that is not so accountable for the climate crisis, I'm going to insist on a much gentler cap, and maybe even a cap that's going to go up, just not at the rate that it should have. So it's not fungible, a cap and trade magnitude, whereas a carbon tax is perfectly fungible. If we impose, pick a number, a $30 per ton carbon tax, well, that is transferable in, yen and marks and pounds, et cetera, to anywhere else in the world. Now, that doesn't oblige them to go at our rate, but if they don't, then we can use the border tax adjustment mechanism, which is considered legal under WTO rules, where we can impose tariffs that will equalize, in effect, the carbon tax. We can impose a tariff equivalent to the carbon tax differential, assuming it's positive. We have one and they don't, or theirs is lower, so that there will not be an unfair advantage to the country that is exporting to us. So transferability is another area in which the carbon tax is clearly superior. The whole issue of trading And you can't have a cap without trade. I mean, a cap has to be trade because otherwise you would have intersectoral disparities and inefficiencies, and the whole thing would fall apart. And the problem with trading, well, it's really twofold. One is that some amount of the dollars that are precious, that either have to go into energy efficiency and renewable energy investment, or have to be distributed or dividended to families so that they're not pushed to the wall by the higher carbon price under a cap or a tax for that matter. Well, under a cap and trade system, some of those dollars are going to flow to market participants, to lawyers, to consultants, to financiers, to specialists, to the regulatory and bureaucratic mechanism that's going to have to regulate and monitor all this. Whereas under a carbon tax, we have an existing tax system. We're only talking under either system about a couple of thousand points where the coal is sold from the mine to the utility, or where the oil is imported or taken out of the ground and sent to the refinery. But all those places are already monitored and taxed and regulated under the IRS code. And there does not have to be a large new bureaucracy that's going to siphon off some of that money. The other problem is a problem that ultimately is political, and it involves the issue of corporate financial criminality that we, a year ago, who knew, except for a few people? Well, now we all know. And maybe I'll get into more discussion of that in the political discussion, because that's part of why the momentum has gone out of cap and trade and is shifting to a carbon tax. The last point, or these main points, actually, I'm sorry, I want to sort of circle back to this issue of what failed with the European Union. And Rick was arguing, I think, that it was primarily a data problem, that the numbers weren't known as to what the permits were. And I submit that this is a fiction. Everybody knows what the numbers are. It's not a difficult thing to know how much carbon is being emitted. But don't take my word. Take the word of the New York Times in an article from December 11th that you may have read. Money and lobbyists hurt European efforts to curb gases. And how Washington now has seen the beginnings of the same lobbying frenzy that bedeviled Europe. I'm reading now. Beseeched by giant utilities and smokestack industries that feared for their competitiveness, the European Union scrapped the idea of forcing industries to buy their permits with the money going to public coffers. Instead, government gave out the vast majority of the permits for nothing in such quantity that the market nearly collapsed. It wasn't a problem of information or data or communications. It was a problem of political power. And it is the political power of the partners of NRDC and EDF in U.S. CAP, the U.S. Climate Action Partnership. It is their belief, these corporations who, yes, have to be brought under the tent in some way, it is their belief that they are going to be able to exact tribute. They are, in effect, classic rent seekers who see a cap and trade which is opaque and complex and mysterious. They see that as a smokescreen, a curtain behind which they can cut their deals and postpone, at some point, 10 years, 20 years, all the permits will be auctioned. They want that transition, not so that they can, make the transition, so that they can keep the rents, in effect, the billions of dollars, the multi-billions of dollars that those permits will be worth. They want to not have to pay that. And they will be able, yes, Obama may say this, but when you consider how Congress works, it seems inconceivable that a cap and trade system is going to be enacted here at the national level without some giveaway of the permits. But the last of these points has to do with honesty and transparency. And I'm going to make an argument here that is both ethical and pragmatic. The problem of a carbon tax has always been the three-letter word. And since 1978, Proposition 13 in California, the Lafler, Jarvis, who, for 30 years, you couldn't get up in public in the United States. You couldn't get reelected if you were going to talk about a tax, even a revenue-neutral tax, which I should stress is part of the position of the Carbon Tax Center. The carbon taxes or prices under a cap and trade system are going to be really high. There is no way of getting around it. They need to be high to elicit the changes at every level that need to be made to get us off of fossil fuels. It's not just a question of having the 100 mpg cars, it's having everybody or the average drive half as much as we do now, and then 20 years later having that again. We need to extract every ounce of carbon out of this system and keep it in the ground instead. So those prices have to be high, which means that those monies are going to need to be rebated or distributed, dividended back to the American people. It's not just the bottom 20% who will be pushed to the wall, it's probably the bottom 80%. But we need to keep faith or be faithful and be honest and be candid with the American people about what we are doing. If we institute a carbon cap and trade system, and after the long lead time, it finally kicks in and energy prices go up and people see their electric bills go up and their gasoline pump prices rise and heating oil, etc. Well, we didn't go for this. We just wanted a carbon cap. Well, guess what? This was part of the deal, but we just never told you. And I don't think it is paranoid in any way to anticipate that at that point in the future, the American people, not having gone for this or feeling that they didn't buy into this, are going to revolt and scrap the system. And what we need to do instead is to be honest, to be candid, and to admit and say, yes, this is a tax. It is a tax that is going to sustain our environment, that is going to sustain life for our children and our grandchildren and species and all beings on this planet, that we can do with a minimum of economic dislocation. And here's how. And it is something that we all need to be brought into together. It seems to me that this is, in a sense, returning, a carbon tax would return the environmental movement to some semblance of its roots, the roots that were rooted in John Muir, in Rachel Carson, in David Brower, who spoke very eloquently of how the utilities were scrubbing their stacks with our lungs. Now, I know David is gone, and I didn't have this conversation with him when he was still alive. I am convinced, because he always, from the first time I met him in the early 70s, he talked about the need to internalize the costs of production in the prices that were paid. David, what are you talking about? Internalize? You know, it took me a while to get with it, and I was an economist and he was an English major. But I think that environmentalists, we need to get out of the ghetto that we have found ourselves in, where we are just another special interest. That's how we are perceived. And I think, paradoxically, that by being candid and honest about a carbon tax and leveling with the American people, we have a chance to do that. Now, I've used up my time. Later, if we have a chance, I'd like to talk about what's going on in Congress and how it is that the momentum is shifting away from cap and trade toward a carbon tax.
Question.
I have three questions actually, which I might address it to you first. You're the first one who mentioned the health concern. One is how to ensure environmental justice with the cap and trade allowances. Secondly, whether McKinsey and Company and your other work you factored in the decrease in cost by reducing the pollution that is affecting health to such a great extent. And thirdly, is NRDC working with the United Arab Emirates on their huge endeavor, which was just written about in the Times a couple of days ago. Huge amount of money going into solar and other technology, and they're actually developing a city with neutral carbon footprint. And those are the main questions I wanted to ask, if you would address those.
Sure. So starting with the Masdar project in United Arab Emirates, to my knowledge, NRDC doesn't have any direct involvement in that effort, although certainly it's an interesting endeavor and looks like a great proving ground for a bunch of renewable technologies and urban design. I haven't followed in any depth.
Yes, they have a lot of money going to U.S. universities for research on that.
Absolutely. To my knowledge, none of my colleagues are doing that, but it is certainly interesting. In terms of the public health benefits of dealing with global warming, those are not factored into the McKinsey cost curve work. It's just one of the conservative assumptions built into clean and clear an analysis as possible and not get into analytic debates about things that weren't totally essential to the argument around those cost curves. But they're certainly important, and when we think about the benefits of transforming our energy economy, it really is a national economic and environmental security story. And within environmental security, there's the climate change benefits and the public health benefits, and they're all important. And in fact, the dollar amounts, as I'm sure you well know, on sort of cost benefit related to public health are very large, very, very tangible. So, point well taken. In terms of the question of ensuring environmental justice within the context of cap and trade, a couple of thoughts. One is that, as I alluded to, in terms of the lower income consumers, we do feel that it's essential that we make sure that some of the allowance value is used for not just tax reductions, but even cash rebates to those who may not be paying taxes in order to ensure that lower income households are not adversely affected, as I mentioned before. So that's one piece of it. And there's an important question as to where you draw the line on that, how do you define low income, et cetera. But in any event, that's the basic principle. There are some important differences, of course, between CO2 emissions and local contaminants. And because it is a global pollutant, the CO2 itself, of course, doesn't have any direct health implications. And climate change is a global phenomenon, so you don't have the same local issues on that level that you would with mercury or something like that. Of course, there are corollaries, and so we do need to attend to those issues. And NRDC's philosophy on that is that we will continue to fight for environmental justice and fight against conventional coal plants in all locations, and especially when there's an EJ dimension to it. But you can't necessarily do exactly what you might want to do on that dimension within a cap and trade system per se, but it doesn't stop you from continuing to fight the fight more broadly. And I will say, very importantly, that having that price on emissions under a cap and trade system in general will tend to help across the board drive us away from conventional fossil fuels and the associated local pollution in every location. And then we need to be attendant to the regional and EJ issues as well on other aspects of the fight. I don't know if now is a good time to do it, but at some point, I didn't know I needed to bring my boxing gloves, but I feel like I do need to make some kind of commentary in response to some of the points made. Should I hold that, or should I go ahead and ramble on?
Unless there's some factual questions.
Yes.
If I may, one question before that, because I think there's a third way in this, and that is there's a lot of advocacy for either approach. Mm-hmm. Is there an advocacy for a hybrid approach? Because political expediency, as well as just the need to test innovative approaches, almost requires that not only do we look at both cap and trade and carbon taxing, but cap and trade systems that are either based on allocation or auction, because we're probably going to see something that's an amalgam of all of these. So the question I have, and might set the stage for the boxing match, is what is that middle path? Is that being explored?
Yeah, well, that's actually a perfect segue to, I will try to just make one point, at least for the moment. There are literally 10 that I'd like to address, but we won't have time. There is more in common between a carbon tax and a cap and trade than different. And in fact, there is a spectrum between a carbon tax and cap and trade. So for example, you can have a cap on emissions implemented by a flexible carbon tax. You make a commitment to 80% reductions. And by the way, I would argue that that quantitative goal is important, and there is a scientific basis, however imperfect, for the targets that we have worldwide and for what constitutes a fair U.S. share of those emissions reductions that we need to achieve in order to at least contain the risk of climate change. That is not a fact-free zone. We can talk meaningfully about the kinds of reductions that we need, and it's important that we have those reductions in mind and a clear mechanism to do our part in terms of addressing the overall global emissions reduction goals. For example, to keep expected warming to something like 2 degrees centigrade. Understanding that there are uncertainties and all that, but at least we have some clue. We're not blind. In fact, the IPCC has given us quite a bit of information, and other modelers. So in any event, starting from a pure tax, you could then move to a tax that has that's flexible in order to help ensure that we reach some specific target. So it's a cap and tax kind of approach. Now then you could go into let's start on the other side. Let's talk about a pure cap and trade, where indeed you don't know what the price will be on allowances. You don't know what that price on emissions will be. You know the quantity. You don't know the price. What you can do there is put things like a price floor in place, and in fact, that is looking increasingly likely. That if it turns out that we are better than we hope at reducing emissions cheaply, then some of the pollution allowances are simply taken off the market in order to maintain the price on emissions above a certain level. And that is a very useful way to get faster emissions reductions if we're able to get them done, and to give investors certainty about the minimum price on CO2 that they may face. A related point, I know I'm getting into my 10 issues, but I'll just say one other point, which is that on the volatility question, and the overall kind of market mechanism question, one of the things that has worked and is working in the European Union system is the fundamental trading mechanism. There is a market, there are trades, there are futures markets. It is possible for businesses to hedge, and you can regulate this commodity just like any other commodity market to ensure that there's no manipulation. We need to do that. We need to have financial regulation across the board, and this is yet another example of that. But it simply means you have to prevent any one trader from cornering the market or any other kinds of manipulation. And then the overarching point here, though, is that there's a spectrum, and that we need to find a way to begin this process with long-term clarity for investors and rapid action to transform our economy, because the longer we spend sinking capital into the wrong infrastructure, the harder this is going to be. And so let's pick an approach that is politically feasible and that gets the job done, and it may well be something of a hybrid between pure tax and pure cap and trade.
Let me just come back with 2 points on that. The fact that the trading mechanism in the EU is working, to me, it's kind of a sad, sour fact. And I'm sort of struggling for the analogy. It's as if you had 2 people who were trying to make electricity from the wind, and one of them put up a classic, clean, metal, tall turbine, and the other decided that he was going to do it with playing cards and balsa wood and vegetables and old tires or whatever. And finally this other person finished and was able to do it and pointed to it. But like why bother? Why go to that effort? Why prove something that is such a second best solution? And something that Dan and I say at the Carbon Tax Center is that for putting a price on carbon, which we are agreed needs to be done, the gold standard is the carbon tax. It's clear. It's simple. It doesn't need a 25-page explanation. You can basically do it in 25 words. It uses an existing structure. And so, I guess I would put the question back to Rick. If we could roll there's a certain path dependence. We all know that paradigm. That's why we have QWERTY typewriters and stuff. The 1997 Kyoto Accords were built around a cap and trade system. And they, in turn, may have been modeled after the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments on SO2, which I've acknowledged worked rather well for that pollutant. But if you could roll the clock back to Kyoto, if NRDC could, if EDF could, would you guys have instead gone for a carbon tax? Or maybe to ask that question a little bit more invidiously, why are you insistent? I mean, I guess I...
It's Charlie.
Yeah, well, no,
It's with love.
well, actually, David, the love was at the beginning. The love was at the beginning. But in this is the collaboration. Yeah. In 19
Just didn't expect it. So
okay, David, thanks.
It's not
David.
it's not a personal thing.
Okay, David.
It's with passion that's being offered.
Okay, thank you. Dan and I, in effect, we waited 20 years. I published an op-ed in the Washington Post on March 6, 1989, calling for a carbon tax. I waited for one of the big guys, the older guys than me, the smarter guys, the cooler guys, and the better looking guys, and the guys with the money, at NRDC and EDF and at the World Resources Institute to finally push for a carbon tax. And Dan and I woke up in late '06 and realized it wasn't going to happen, and we had to do it ourselves. Why are you guys holding out for this system that is so convoluted, so complex, is on the verge, on the cusp of being discredited, because it's going to be seen as part and parcel with Bernie Madoff and poorly understood financial instruments? I mean, why are you still wedded to this scheme?
Capitalism.
Where to begin? So, I mean, I think that, let me first talk a little bit about some of the generalities that have come up here, cap trade versus carbon tax. And I'm not going to speak to the whole history of NRDC. I've only been at NRDC for 2 years, and so I can't claim credit for any things that you attributed to NRDC on the positive side, nor am I to blame for all the things that you have tackled on the other side of the ledger. What I will say, though, is that, honestly, in my view, there's more heated agreement here than disagreement. We need a price on carbon. We need a stable, long-term system that will allow investors to begin to transform our entire energy economy. And by the way, our agriculture and forestry sector as well. And guess what? Doing that isn't going to be simple. Even if you want to take a pure tax approach, it will not be simple. Now, let me speak to that a little bit. There is precedent for effective carbon taxes in some regard out of Canada. But let's not forget the precedent from Scandinavia, where politics don't disappear just because you're fighting over tax code, as people may note from other contexts. And in Scandinavia, when they went to institute carbon taxes, what happened? Industry exempted themselves. Basically, all the major emitters were off the table in various forms of loopholes. And so you ended up with an ineffective tax code because of those very same political economy challenges, which I agree are very real and are very meaningful, serious challenges. But I think, again, it points to the fact that this is a fundamentally complicated challenge. We're talking about changing the whole way we do business across the whole economy, and we're not going to dodge the political challenge of bringing all the different stakeholders to the table, measuring the emissions accurately across the different sectors, bringing in ag and forestry in a productive way, just because we choose one particular ideology or another in terms of how we implement. And again, I think the fundamental point was referenced earlier by the gentleman who just left. This is, at least in my view, and this is really speaking for myself personally, not NRDC, this is a spectrum of options, all of which have to do with driving down emissions and putting a price on emissions in order to help make that happen. And you can have a cap and trade, which has a price floor that looks a lot like a tax in many regards. And so the devil's in the details. We have to get the details right. And by the way, we can't let perfection be the enemy of the good, because we've got to get moving now. We can't have years and years of additional delay. Final point, I don't believe that if we went down a pure tax route, that we would see Congress signing up to launch that tax immediately or being able to implement it immediately. There would be some pre-work that would have to be done in order to get all the measurements figured out and figure out the role of ag and forestry and so on and so forth.
That's important.
Well, we can talk about that offline, but yeah.
I want to take the opportunity, just since I really haven't delved deeply into it. I really welcome the opportunity to hear back and forth, but I just in terms of nailing down some of the basic concepts and paradigm. What I'm understanding, because I'm coming this as basically ignorant, I'm hearing cap and trade as a way of basically tabulating and quantifying the entire package, and then coming up with a way, with the end result and desire is basically to end up with lower emissions. And so you basically quantify who's all doing what into the whole picture, and you basically come up with a way of putting a price tag and then ratcheting down. So it's basically a regulatory mechanism, so that at the end of a period of time you end up with less by increasing the amount available and the price tag paid for that, so that the system makes itself more efficient. Is that correct?
Broadly, yes. I mean, the essential point on cap and trade is that you're putting a quantitative limit on pollution rights, and then you're allowing people to trade, and out of that trading comes the price revelation.
So my question is, how does tax, outside of putting a tax on that, how does that end up at the end of that same period, ending up with, what's the conceptual mechanism whereby at the end of a 50-year period you end up with less emissions?
Okay, let's just look like sort of 5 years out, because it is, maybe we can agree that under either cap and trade or a carbon tax. That Congress, it might have goals or a resolution about 2050, but it's probably not going to go more than 5 or 10 years out in terms of how much the cap is going to come down, if it's a cap, or how much the tax is. No, wait. I'm trying to make a point. Having all of the actors in our economy, and that's not just like big players, that's everybody in this room too. It's 305 million Americans, in corporations, etc. Having all of us know ahead of time the trajectory of a carbon tax, and knowing that 10 years from now, driving is going to cost this, and electricity is going to cost this, and manufacturing is going to cost that, which we will know with a carbon tax, but we will not know with a carbon cap. That is vital information to accelerate our transition away from fossil fuels.
Well, my question is that over 50, if you take the same model, I'm just trying to understand the basics of the paradigm. So that under the cap and trade and the 50-year model, you basically quantify and you reduce it. The target is that after a period of time, you end up with these level of emissions, which is reduced to a certain period. My question for you is that under a tax, under a 50-year period, how do you propose to end up with a lower emissions? Net lower emissions under that model.
The information, the knowledge, the price certainty that a tax will provide is going to make sure that all of those decisions that will dictate how much carbon we are emitting at any point in the future, those will be better carbon decisions under a tax than under a cap.
So you're saying, assuming that people just want to be efficient because it's going to cost them, or as part of the cost of business, that they're going to want to make things more efficient to save money.
Well, of course. I mean, how else did demand for gasoline in the United States fall by 4% in 2008 as compared to 2007, even though the economy actually did get larger? It's because of the price impact. And I'm sorry, maybe we both should have stressed that, or maybe I should have stressed it more. But price drives behavior. It's not the only thing that drives behavior, and I totally agree with Rick and NRDC on the need to knock down those institutional barriers, split incentives, regulatory standards, priming the pump for energy efficiency, for renewables. We are in complete agreement on that. But basically, price drives behavior.
So am I correct in saying that this is basically a regulatory mechanism? This is basically just ratcheting up the price so people want to make things more efficient to save money?
I shouldn't speak for the cap and trade, but you've correctly characterized the carbon tax side.
I would just say that it comes down to the question of what do you want to fix. With a cap and trade, a pure cap and trade, you're fixing the emissions reduction, and you have certainty around that. The price per ton of reductions will then float. Okay. Or you can do the converse with the tax. Right. Or you can do something in the middle with a hybrid mechanism like a cap and trade with a price floor.
Okay. Great, thanks.
Yeah, I want 2 points that Charlie made. I just wanted to, one comment and then one extrapolation. The first is that the carbon tax will make it much more visible to consumers who could be let off the hook. It's extremely important for people to understand that it isn't simply the responsibility of the utilities or industry to reduce energy use, but consumer demand is extremely important, and I think the tax will make it much more clear, as well as the dividend, so they make that connection. Charlie made an interesting comment about, which I inferred he meant that bad science was worse than no science. But there is some science here, and most people are missing it. And the science doesn't have to do with how much we're going to reduce energy, but actually phase out fossil fuels. And the science is based on the issue of the increase in the average global temperature. And what Hansen and other studies have found is that if you have more than a 2 degree Celsius increase in that temperature, you risk going into a new climate regime which would have vast ecological consequences, not just economic. So the issue becomes one of what they call climate sensitivity. I don't fully understand it, but it connects the issue of how much energy use will contribute to reaching that 2% increase or exceeding it. And what they have found now is that we are on our way to exceeding that 2 degrees Celsius increase. And that is why Hansen and others are saying that while we're at 389 parts per million of CO2, we have to reduce that carbon footprint back to 350. So there is science to this. And there is an issue of whether we have already exceeded it or how much is absolutely meaningless in terms of this. But the point is, you can use that 2 degrees Celsius and the 350 parts per million to say, if we want to get back to 350, this is how much we have to reduce our energy use right now, and at what rate. So there is science there. And as far as I can tell, industry, corporations, government is completely ignoring the science that we do have. And I think this is a big problem, and it's a bigger problem with the carbon trading, which will simply continue our reliance specifically on coal. And Rick didn't mention whether U.S. CAP is talking about shutting down coal plants, which Hansen says is really the first thing we have to do. And if they are calling for shutdown, over what period of time between now and 2030 or 2050? So those are some other unanswered questions. But we do have science, and we're not working from it. The activists aren't working from it, and the industry and corporations aren't working from it. And we have to get back to that.
Yeah. Actually, we're sort of running against the time deadline, so maybe David and then Bill want to mention something. Maybe we could come add a couple of others.
Yeah. First, I'm sort of wondering about the right place. In a sense, this was formed, Major Network, having been in the formation, as something to sort of celebrate and work towards an understanding of nature and ecosystems in the New York metropolitan region. And I'm thinking, for a minute, what does this debate have to do? And part of this debate may not be directly related, but there's a few things that I think really link those two things very strongly, and they haven't been, I think, really adequately addressed in terms of their impact by either of you. And one is the difference between New York energy consumption in New York City region and the rest of the country, which is a lot of our consumption is building driven. And why is that? It's because 40% of the people in Manhattan don't even have a driver's license. You know, we have a whole model of how to achieve personal happiness, to get back to Gus Speth's kind of talk, without doing the kind of environmental damage. And the other part of that I think links these things is, if you look at New York as a leader in how to live a good life without having the same amount of impact, the difference between our, per capita use and I'm moving here to see Charlie at the same time. Between our per capita use and India and China, one of the big reasons is we had a huge effort here in New York with Robert Moses, and he led the way for the rest of the country, to destroy public transportation and build a highway system on every waterfront. And that was also a boon for the whole real estate industry, which led to this great suburbanization. How can we get these kinds of plans in sync with the kind of the smart growth thing, which will make a huge difference in what our national energy consumption policy is? I think there's really a good lesson for New York that still isn't being totally learned, because we still have, the suburban type developments right now on the boards for places like Staten Island within the city, let alone within the region.
Bill, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm just kind of desperate to get you guys together. I mean, I've been in the Senate office, and I wouldn't know what to do if you guys came in. I mean, they want to know, well, what do you want me to do? What does the legislation call for? And is there any way, I mean, Charlie's got a bunch of congressmen who are on the carbon tax side. I'm sure you have a bunch of senators, especially. Well, NRDC. Is there a way for us to continue this, at least you two to continue it, so that we don't go into Congress as adversaries? We're not adversaries, obviously.
But I know there's a lot to respond to that, but I did want to get a couple from the members before our time closes. Did you have a quick comment?
The question is quick. Do the cap and trade and the carbon tax, do you cover the same sectors of the economy?
Yeah, we all should cover everything.
But, well, that's the question. I mean, you've got to measure, and then the question is, where do you measure the carbon and where you don't?
We agreed on that also. far upstream the same number of points. It's not the case that either system would involve, measuring at the supermarket where somehow you're scanned for the carbon footprint of the tomatoes that are imported from Chile. That would be way upstream, at the oil refiner that sold the jet fuel to the company that sent the, blah blah blah. So we're the same on that.
Okay.
Where it gets complicated is how do you deal with the agriculture and forestry sector and non-fossil CO2 emissions, but I don't know that we have time to get into that in details. I would say that for either approach that's challenging. Anyhow.
Well, just actually to maybe get at something like the commonalities altogether, I think are probably real. In a sense, we live in a cap and trade system in terms of the overall export of carbon dioxide, even by natural systems, and the incorporation of carbon dioxide into soil systems globally. And the thing that's missing from both approaches, which I think is absolutely critical from a kind of ecological perspective, is that in a city like New York, where we use 1.2 billion gallons of water each day, when you just charge that as wastewater, you lose an opportunity. That opportunity cost is to fix about 200,000 tons of carbon daily. That's optimally. You probably could do something more like 50,000 tons, but you get the point. It's especially important for the agricultural and the forestry sector because literally water is the medium that drives carbon capture, and we don't, so far that's slipping through the cracks in both systems because there's not the positive side of the approach. The other point for cities, building on what David said and otherwise, that same 1.2 billion gallons is the equivalent of 35 tons of air conditioning each day, enough to make New York City to drop literally the thermal signal of this whole landscape and to reverse the urban heat island. So the point is that so far the tax and the cap and trade systems are aiming at something which I think we absolutely have to know. How much carbon dioxide is coming from where, when, and how do you actually get it to balance out? But what you get it to balance out with is so far not in the mix, and we could put it in the mix. We could basically look at refurbishing, redesigning infrastructure so it captures water, so it actually fixes carbon. But we're not on that map yet, although you want shovel-ready projects? I think we've got some.
Maybe. Well, just I'll throw it to you, but I'll put my moderator hat back on. We want to move on to our reports and so forth from the groups, but obviously that's. I think I want to turn to Bill to have closing thoughts and maybe engage the speakers in their thoughts as well.
Well, I'd certainly like each of you to spend a minute or two on where we should go from here and what a group like this can do to help and get some kind of action through Congress in 2009. I think it's desperate.
This isn't added, if I could be rude, is to say that question of where are you at? And you said that more than commonalities, that there was some move to actually merge the two ideas. Yeah, I haven't heard that coming from you.
I wish there was, but we don't think
so the question is, if there's anything that we could do, is is that first piece a gift that we could offer up here? Is there enough there that there could be serious conversations in order to move this to that next level? Just to add on to Bill's questions.
I hate to give the sobering, verdict on this. Dan and I have tried for the last 2 years to see if there were ways to construct a hybrid system that would be better than either of them. We even have a foundation grant that's been dangled in front of us that will pay us to do work to create a report. And you know what? We've done practically nothing on this because we talk about it every week or two. And we don't see any way to combine the two. And I don't think it's because we are ideologically driven and are in our own particular world. It's that the carbon tax, and this is not to say that the carbon tax will solve everything by itself. And I again emphasize that the regulatory standards, the tearing down of institutional barriers, all these things need to be supplementing the price signal from either system, and momentum should not be let up from that for a second. But the carbon tax is truly the gold standard. It is the clear, easy to implement, transparent, and equitable, if the revenues are recycled appropriately, way to supplement and really give a big push to all of the traditional tools that NRDC has been the leader in our community in creating and implementing. And so, grafting something else onto it, or grafting it onto something else, it seems to serve no purpose. I guess I just also want to say that sentiment in Congress, I would be overstating the case to say that it is, sort of shifting massively toward us. But the momentum is growing, as evidenced by the fact that just in the past month, Republican Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee became, and I'm quoting from an industry newsletter, became a U.S. Senate Republican, adding his voice to the growing carbon tax chorus. That's from a McGraw-Hill newsletter last week. And of course, many of you saw over Christmas the op-ed by none other than Arthur Laffer and Republican Representative David Inglis from South Carolina, an op-ed for a carbon tax in the New York Times, an emissions plan conservatives could warm to. And a carbon tax is quickly becoming the vehicle of choice, the bipartisan vehicle of choice that's going to be needed to get not just any pricing system through Congress, but a robust one that has, whether it's cap and trade or a carbon tax, the downward cap slope or the upward tax trajectory that's going to be big enough to make the difference that we all agree needs to be made.
Sure, I was sure the timing we probably need to get.
It's a very good question.
Okay.
We didn't finish this question.
I just wanted to ask Rick, after this conversation, one of the things you talked about was the difficulty of implementing a tax in Congress, political problem. If NRDC came down on side of a carbon tax, just, what if? Do you think it would improve the chances for doing something like that?
We'd like to think we have some influence, so hopefully it would move the needle in some regard. It's hard to know exactly how that would play out. What I want to emphasize is a few things. First, we are in agreement on some of the basic points. We need a long-term system, we need a way to put a price on emissions, and we need all the other regulatory mechanisms to help, with appliance standards and building codes and enforcement of all that, and ways to get clean technologies into the picture. So at least on that sort of fundamental, what do we want to see change, I think we're in clear agreement. And I think we're also in agreement that we need to transform the whole way that we run our energy economy, and quickly. So those are the objectives. Now, in order to get there, we need to move quickly on the legislative front. And that's almost an oxymoron. Even with the new Congress, even with the new president, it is structurally hard to make major change in the U.S. legislature. Now, there's lots of nuance to the cap and trade and carbon tax discussion, as we've started to tease out in a perhaps less than fully structured way in this discussion, which I didn't even realize was really on that theme today. But in any event, we can see that there's a lot of complexity here. And there are pros and cons in the details of each approach. And then there's a spectrum of options in between. I would argue that a cap and trade with a price floor, again, looks a lot like it has elements of a tax in it. There's some price certainty provided in the cap and trade if you put that price floor in place. So a whole range of options, a whole range of pros and cons in the details. But what we have to remember is that if we don't have a unified approach to getting something done on the Hill, we risk further delay. Right. And we have to remember that the president-elect has said very clearly that he is in favor of a cap and trade system, that industry is pushing in that direction, that a lot of the environmental community has been pushing in that direction. And I think we have to be careful not to allow perfection to be the enemy of the good. And I don't think it's possible to have a perfect tax approach. I don't think it's possible to have a perfect cap and trade approach. What we are very busy trying to do is make sure that the legislation we get in place has important elements of certainty about the emissions reductions, as well as certainty for investors, including a price floor on emissions, on allowances, and that we move towards consensus as rapidly as we can. So I guess I would ask for I would invite further dialogue on this, and I would ask for an effort to reach consensus sooner than later as an environmental community, because the last thing we want to be doing is fighting amongst one another as we try to make one of the biggest changes in the legislative history of the United States in a big hurry, while there's a lot of other stuff crowding out on the agenda.
One quick, can you provide any kind of reference of how to just get our minds wrapped around the pertinent details, resources, so we can understand the issues?
I mean, I don't want to do a shameless plug, but I've been co-leading with Dan Latchoff at NRDC an effort which we've been calling CAP 2.0. We've just begun to put policy briefs up on the website. It's NRDC/CAP 2.0. There's only one up there right now, but there will be a dozen by the end of the month, and then modeling results to follow. So we'll invite commentary on those and questions around those, and hopefully that'll be of some value. Again, just to set expectations, there's only one up for the moment, but wait a week or two.
Charlie,
much more.
I think I really appreciate those comments, and I know there are many other comments and questions that people have, and I think we really need to sort of move forward with the agenda.
I'd just like to say one thing.
Sure.
Neither of these are going to sail unless we alarm the people in our area that we can talk to at the current state of the global environment. I mean, we're failing to really set the danger to all of us of the current situation, and nobody's going to pass anything unless the constituents that we talk to every day are as alarmed as we in this room are, because we know the facts and we need to bring those facts to everybody we know. So regardless of which side wins in Congress, we need to support either side by alarming people, telling the truth about the state of CO2.
And I unfortunately just saw a little bit of Blue Dogs last night. I can tell you that that's a very important message. There is still rampant confusion on the science, unfortunately, in the media, not in the scientific community. And unfortunately, we're still afflicted with this problem of, on the one hand, on the other hand, journalism in which the tiny minority of climate skeptics are given equal footing, if not excessive footing, with those in the vast majority of the scientific community that say we need to deal with this.
I have a question about NRDC. I mean, why is NRDC all on its own going to form this industry alliance with the coal utilities instead of going out to the environmental community, groups like this and all the other groups, getting everyone in a room and saying, what can we agree on, that will be in the public interest, not in the interest of the corporations and the utilities? I find that alliance, U.S. CAP, that NRDC and EDF and Pew Center and WRI have involved in, I find that a slap in the face to the public and to the rest of the environmental community. And I find that it's a very strong statement on their part on where they perceive their allies to be rather than the environmental community.
Can I speak briefly to that? I do feel I need to just make...
You see, if you step in earlier, then you...
I'm sorry, but
no, you should.
I have to give some response, I think, to that. Because we have... First off, I don't mean to characterize anyone as anyone's enemy here, but let's just say that even in the extreme case of an enemy, there's value in negotiation. Now, in terms of the adversaries that we find across the table in some global warming discussions, it's important to talk to them. It's important to talk across all lines and try to reach some kind of closure on this. Now, switching to the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, joined with those other environmental organizations that you mentioned, we have felt that it was critical to hammer out some of the details in a forum with the most affected industries in order to get to a place where we can actually implement legislation. At the same time, and equally, if not more so, we are actively engaged with the environmental community, to the Green Group, and every other stakeholder that has deep connection to this issue. So it's not mutually exclusive, but it is an important part of the puzzle in order to work out the details and get something that can actually be passed into law.
But instead of 4 groups in there, you might have had 40 if you'd reached out to the environmental community who could then go in. Of course, we don't have talks.
I think in general, I mean, the idea of differences of opinion and sort of perspectives is sort of, I mean, part of the history of environmental movement, and people obviously have been in touch with this issue for decades and so forth. And is that issue of conflict in terms of how to move forward. I mean, that's been part of the history of the environmental movement among the different groups. And I think it's a really interesting moment where, I mean, because of the lack of federal leadership in many ways and sort of the entrepreneurial actions of states and localities in dealing with the issue of emissions reduction and climate change over the last couple of most of this decade, last 8 years in particular. Now
last 16 years.
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously you can go even longer, but I think that we have this now moment where suddenly, there's sort of an opportunity to sort of bring forward, and there will be legislation of some sort, most likely, addressing these issues, and these kinds of debates with respect to the different perspectives are being carried out in different cities and different localities and different constituent groups throughout the U.S. right now. So this is, I mean, if nothing else, it's sort of an exciting moment.
But there is a quality of closing the barn door after the horse is gone, in the sense that a handful of big players have made the decision that cap and trade is the legislation and is the path for putting a price on carbon, and the rest of us are having to play catch-up.
Well, and I think the issue of the debate and creating the marketplace for exchange of ideas, such as this forum, and I want to thank Bill for really bringing you both into this and to sort of connect it, both with each other and also us as a group, is really where that debate will be played out. And your argument is that that door has been kicked a little bit and maybe kicked a little bit more back open. And so I think the issue still is to be resolved, and maybe Bill's quest of a third path, yet to, a quick sonic hope maybe. But I mean, obviously something will get hammered out. And I think we individually and sort of as we represent our organizations need to figure out ways as actively as possible to sort of define our role in that process. So going back to David Berg's comment as well, the connection between this discussion, which really fosters and connects to the national level, bring it back to the local is what we need to do, because that's inherently what we are, a local organization. We're individuals living in the New York metro region, but also we represent these organizations. So I think this is really a great opportunity to discuss and debate, and hopefully everyone in the room kind of learned a little bit more about this, and that each panel member could, at the end, sort of give their references and source material so we can sort of continue this education. But with that, I mean, just a sort of I want to give Bill any sort of last 10-second comment.
10 seconds. I agree with Charlie's argument, but I renewed my contribution to NRDC very thankfully for all of NRDC.
Environmentalism has always been, I think, a braided stream of perspectives, and I think that we'll carry that forward, and probably maybe now more than we have in the last several years.